Have you ever been like David and just thought that life is going good, no problems, and you got away with it? Even though you knew you did wrong and judgment should be coming, it hasn't yet. Well, today David is in about the 20th year of his reign, and the sin of Amnon has started a long series of both domestic and public trials. And although he's been forgiven and received back into God's favor again, neither the government nor his personal life will ever be the same. All of the judgments which God allowed were connected to his weakness and a consequence of his sin. Today we're going to start chapter 14 of 2 Samuel. And as we do, we find David's son Absalom still living in exile with his grandfather, who is in exile because he killed his oldest brother Amnon for raping his sister Tamar. And the crime was left unpunished by David for 2 years. So, as a natural avenger, Absalom took matters into his own hands. He resolved the issue by killing the son. Amnon used to be David's favorite son. After all, he was his firstborn, and he was the natural heir to the throne. But David's got a new favorite now. It's not Solomon, because Solomon probably has not been born yet. But it is the next one who might be the heir of the throne, and that's Absalom. Absalom has been gone for almost 3 years now. And David, the father in him, longs to be connected to his son, but because of the guilt of bloodshed, which his son still carries, he just can't. After all, there's public opinion. What will the people say? And then there's his own conscience. He knows that as the king of Israel, it's his duty and responsibility to take care of any law. And so all of this held him back. He was not going to make the first move. Well, that's where Joab comes in. Joab was more than David's commander. He was also David's nephew, daughter to David's sister. And because of their long association, Joab had a really good insight into what was going on in David's heart and mind. And he knew that he wanted to bring his son back, but he didn't know how to be both a loving father and a good king to Israel. As king, he thought he could lose the respect. He's already lost it in his family, but now he could lose it as a king over the entire nation. A king who's respected worldwide if he did something like this. And so now David has to choose between parental love and his responsibility and duty as a king. Joab was shrewd enough to realize David was not going to act unless he had a push from the outside. And Joab had just the shrewdness and the personality to give David the shove he wanted. He was going to help him balance his conscience and his heart. And he used his influence to demonstrate this as he restored Absalom back to the kingly family. We pick up in chapter 14 of 2 Samuel. Joab has contacted a woman from Tekoa. Now, she's called a wise woman, probably because she is very fluent in her speech, very intelligent, and can carry on a conversation and answer any question that the king might pose to her. Tekoa was probably about 12 miles south of Jerusalem or so. It was far enough away that David probably had not seen the woman. And if he decided to check into her story without giving an answer right away, chances are he'd have trouble finding the person and being able to route out all the details that he needed. Now, Joab chose a woman for several reasons. First of all, women, we know how to express our feelings and our emotions, and we can do it so much more easily than the men can, and we can do it in such a way that oftentimes we can get our request answered a whole lot easier, and we're able to bring more pity to the situation. She posed as a widow because in Israel, widows and orphans were under special protection of the king. A king was obligated to help them meet their request. And she put on the mourning clothes. He said, don't anoint yourself with oil. Don't look like you've been in mourning continuously, that this is something that is new and fresh to your heart. And seek an audience with the King David and give him your story. Their goal? They wanted to induce David to pardon an intentional murderer and confirm it with an oath that he would do that. Then David would have no excuse in their eyes of not setting Absalom free, or at least bringing him back from exile. So in chapters 14 and verses 4 through 7, the woman gives her appeal. And by soliciting his royal intervention, she lets us know that in the time, anyone from any clan could go before the king and make this either their first appeal, a court of appeals, or in this case, they could take as a final appeal. If they've not been satisfied with an answer or with the ruling of some other lower court, they could take it before the king, and the king would hear. That's what happened here. She goes before the king, dressed like one in mourning, and one of compassion, who needs compassion and assistance, and the king's help. And she begged the king to have mercy for her only surviving son. What she tells the king happened was her two sons were there and no one intervened. And while no one intervened, the one son killed the other son. Now the whole family sought to kill the murderer. Well, just the mention of two sons and one killing the other, one without obvious intervention from others, it had to do something to David's heart. The issue was clear. The murderer had to be punished, and the law for such punishment was death. But it became a little bit clouded in the woman's eyes, because the consequences were, if her son were to die, she would be left with no heir. And that's what the people wanted. The family wanted to destroy him, not just because he was a murderer, but also because he was heir to the throne. And that's why they were seeking revenge. And if they were granted their revenge, she would lose her only remaining son, and her husband's name would be cut off. Now, demise of a family in Israel, loss of a family line, losing the only last relative, that was something that was very important to them. And a man's family there could be seen like a glowing, burning log of wood. And the woman portrayed this as though her husband was that long, burning log of wood, and the fire had gone out all except one last ember that was left. And if that ember were extinguished, then all the memory of her dead husband would be forgotten, and she would have no one to carry her name and no heir, and this would be a personal disaster. Well, in verses 8 through 11, we see that David did want to help the woman, but he sort of brushed her off with a promise of, you know what you're saying sounds really like it might be a just cause, a good case, but let me look into it. I'm going to examine it. I'm going to think about it, and I'll get back with you. The woman knew this was not enough. It was not enough. Maybe David was saying, this is too close to home here. Let me pray about this. Maybe he was saying, this is really a tough case, and my heart wants to say yes, but let me talk to some of my other counselors and see what they have to say. Whatever the reason, David did not give an answer at the moment that the woman was pleased with. However, she was very persistent, and she expressed her willingness to bear any guilt and any social shunning that might occur as a result of diverting the judgment, if only David would let the blood go free, if he would overlook the death of her one son and free her other son from it. She said, "Won't you do this for me?" The real crux of the matter here is David did not have the power to intervene. He did not have the authority to change God's law, which was very, very clear. But she continued begging that he would not allow the family to destroy more, merely for the sake of avenging the blood. And she's asking the king to stop the course of justice and to pardon a homicide. This definitely was exceeding his royal privileges and responsibility. And if it was wrong to prevent avenging of blood, she said, "I'm going to take the guilt." And she pressed and pressed until finally David, with an oath, promised that he would intervene and that her son would not suffer harm. The king yielded in principle to what Joab wanted. He did what the woman had been after him to do. But it wasn't over yet. There still remained application. David had to see that this was more than about an unknown woman and her unnamed son. He had to take it to heart. He had to make it personal. And she did this while still holding on to the figment of her story. And in verses 12 through 17, we see her expound upon it and how she now begins to apply the case to both the king and his kingdom. And let's just paraphrase her argument. "You granted me the pardon of my son who killed his brother, yet you will not grant your own son restoration, because your subjects who are known to you want restoration of Absalom, whose crime is really no greater than my son's, since he did it with cause." And she goes on to say that his circumstances were aggravated, and the king's merciful disposition toward the son of a stranger condemned the fact that he was acting so harshly with his very own son. And she accused David of doing to the nation of Israel what her enemy had tried to do to her family, and that was to take away their heir so that there would be no one to carry on the family name. She says, "Oh, King, the people made me do this. Yeah, I had to do this because the people are so unhappy that Absalom had been banished, and they're fearful. They're fearful because what happens if you die and there's no one to take your place? You have no named successor. There could be a civil war. Or what happens if you die and Absalom comes back and he is named king, but he's been away so long in a foreign country that he has been influenced to take up a false religion, to turn his back on God, and we no longer have a godly king." This would be a public disaster. David listened, and what he may have already known in his heart was that the people, generally and perhaps even universally, had their hearts set on Absalom. His long banishment moved their pity, and you know what they say, absence makes a heart grow fonder. It certainly did in this case. But because of this, even though the law said a murderer has to die, it really might have been out of David's hands to bring him back and cause that extreme punishment to come to him because of the safety of Israel. This crafty woman provided us a great analysis about the brevity of life. She said, "King, if you take a glass of water and you pour it on the ground, you can never get that water back." And she was saying, in essence, that's the way it was with Amnon. He's dead. You cannot bring him back to life. Let's move on with life. Let Absalom live because Amnon can never, ever come back. And maybe she was hinting at a contrast between Absalom and the way he had been treated and the way that God had treated David when he had murdered Uriah. Well, after speaking about Absalom in very frank and clear terms, she goes back to her story. And she keeps to her fictitious tale about her family, and she implies that life is bound up in her son, and without him, she just doesn't know she can go on living. But she says that the king, you're a messenger of God, you're like an angel of God, and I know that wisdom and justice is in you, and you're going to give me the right answer. Well, verses 18 through 20, David uncovers the scheme, and he says, "Amnon, I want you to tell me the truth. Did Joab put you into this? I mean, I can see his fingerprints all over your story there." She confesses. "But King," she said, "Joab was only trying to help. He wanted to be the agent that would bring about change in your relationship with your son Absalom." And she still wants to say in the king's favor, she said, "You are so wise," she said, trying to flatter him, "that no man can ever pull a quick one over on you." In verses 20 and 21, Joab gets sent to bring back Absalom. He gets what he wants then. And the king overlooks the involvement of the woman, knowing that Joab had put her up to this and it was not her fault or responsibility. But he listened to what was perhaps a very sound thinking soldier, and listened to the advice that he had given and sent his back to bring home his exiled son. He said, Joab, you're getting what you want. But the truth is, David was getting what he wanted. David was unwilling to go himself, and that may have proved the fact that he did not really forgive his son. Even though he longed to see him, he was not ready to do that yet. David referred to Absalom as a young man. Go get the young man Absalom. Now, in doing this and using this expression, what he really did was decrease his crime as being the act of youthful impulse, poor judgment, a rash decision. He didn't want to be too hard on him. Joab had made other attempts, it appears, to bring reconciliation without success, and now he graciously thanks the king, bows before him, while in his mind Joseph is complimenting and congratulating himself on the fact that he brought the father and the son back together again with what was going to be in his mind a lasting resolution. You see, Joab intended, his aim was to establish himself in the good graces of the king and his son, whom many thought would be the next heir to the throne. After Amnon's death, there still remained the second son by Abigail, Gilead, but we never hear of him other than his birth. There's a record of that, and that's it. So many think that he either died at a very young age, or for some reason he was just incapable of assuming leadership. That put Absalom very next in line after Amnon's death. And Joab, as commander of the army, was very concerned about a smooth transition there. Extenuating circumstances probably had a big play in David's accepting Absalom back into the kingdom. After all, Tamar's rape, Amnon's was judged because of that by his brother, who became the avenger of blood in the family. Think about the penalty Absalom had already paid by being, this self-imposed banishment for years. And Absalom, if he stays there, he's in a country where no one can get justice from him. And not only that, he really might be influenced to take up heathen worship and heathen ways. Then the safety of the kingdom depended upon an heir, and the people seemed to favor Absalom. And then, lastly, but as they say, not leastly, there was the father's love for the son. These considerations do form an excuse for the pardon and bringing Absalom back, bringing back a blood-stained son. And so the father's heart in David won out over the king and his responsibilities. But in doing that, he overlooked the fact that he was the ultimate authority, and he was bound to execute impartial judgment on every murderer by the law of God, which he had no right to change. And granting pardon to Absalom, David was acting like a king rather than the king and royal magistrate that God called him to be. Ultimately, in doing this, David aided Absalom in his future revolt and rebellion. And we see David's sin and the judgments of God which occurred through his indulgence to Absalom. So in verses 23 and 24, Absalom does return. Joab had permission, and he went to get Absalom on one condition. It wasn't that he not be punished. The condition was that he not appear before the king. David showed some mercy to Absalom, but he refused to let him appear in order that he might not approve of his sin in public. Yeah, he didn't want to hurt his own conscience. He did not want to lose his honor publicly, and he didn't want to encourage Absalom or others like them to continue and cause those sins. Absalom returned to his home, and there was no reconciliation. There was no change in his behavior or his condition. Absalom's sin festered, and in his mind the scheming began. When David called him back, he had two possible options that would have solved the issue. He could have executed Absalom for murder, or he could have tried to restore him through confession and repentance. But David, who was been so weakened now by his own sin, chose neither of these. Again, his own sin morally paralyzed him because of guilt, and his position increasingly weakened with the people because there had been just a series of one disaster after another in his family. And that constant burden of God's projected judgment that he always felt, it began to manifest itself more evidently and more quickly in David's life. And in verses 25 through 27, we see the seeds of rebellion really starting, not just to be planted, but now they're starting to sprout. You see, if before his return from exile, Absalom had been a type of hero, his presence in home exile for these 2 years in Jerusalem and being in semi-banishment only increased the general sympathy for him. Whatever anyone might say against him during that time, he had some things going in favor of him. Why? He was every bit the prince, from head to toe. I mean, he was handsome. He was brave. He was warm-hearted, kind, outgoing, and very loyal to anyone that he loved. Oh, and that beautiful child of his, he named her Tamar, after his sister who had been so terribly dishonored. And he was not like other Israelites who tried to just push their sons to the forefront. Even though he had 3 sons, years later in Jerusalem, he claimed to have no sons. Perhaps it was because they had died early, or perhaps it was because he saw they would not follow in his footsteps. Absalom was the most handsome man in all of Israel. It said from head to foot, there was not a blemish, not a pimple, not a wart. No fault could be found on him anywhere. And he had inherited his father's good looks. Tamar, Absalom, all the sons of David, they were known for their good looks. And many viewed him as Israel's next king. His extraordinary popularity came from his personality, his manners, and his appearance. Oh, and we can't talk about appearance without mentioning that long flowing hair that he cut every year just because it weighed so much. And it was heavy on his head, and when they weighed it, 200 shekels. Well, in verses 19 through 28 and 29, Absalom gets a little tired. Whatever sin or error that David had committed in bringing Absalom back, he displayed great caution in the fact that he said, he's not going to see me. until things are better. This slight of the father was perhaps designed to bring repentance, but what happened was, without communication, it only hardened Absalom's heart further. 2 full years having his liberty restricted and life more separated from people in Jerusalem than it had been while he was in exile in a foreign country was terrible for exile. Not allowed to appear in court was evident that he was out of favor with the king. And even his cousin Joab did not think it prudent to go and see him. He would not go to Absalom, partly because he observed Absalom's attitude. And he could easily see that if this man rises to power, and he is so fickle in what he does, he could turn against me, and I could lose everything. And he also recognized enough danger in Absalom's mind and in his thinking to realize there's going to be trouble for both the king and the kingdom if he is fully restored. So Joab's refusal to heed Absalom's summons contribute to Absalom's simmering hatred for the royal house and everything that it stood for. And Joab refused to go to him, and he refused to take a message to the king. And this only left a very proud, violent person to brood over his supposed wrongs. Verses 30 and 32 tell us exactly what Absalom did. He called his servants. He was going to get Joab's attention. He set his field of barley on fire. Joab, who would not go for any other reason, went to demand retribution, to demand an excuse, an apology. What did Absalom say? No. He said, "Come here so that I might send you to the king." He was treating Joab like nothing but a servant. He says he's better off in exile. And he claims that estrangement from his father, the king, when he is so near, is more grievous and shameful to him than ever before. Absalom saw that his father had accomplished his purpose when he called him back. But that certainly had not accomplished Absalom's purpose. Absalom wanted to get into the hearts of the people. And so he pleaded with Joab, saying, "If I am guilty of this offense, let me be punished and fully forgiven." I either want to be punished or I want to be forgiven if I am guilty. It seems by this time Absalom, in his aloneness, had received just enough favor that in his mind he replayed the events and started to see that maybe there really wasn't anything wrong with what I did. Or if there was, there certainly wasn't enough for death. And the final verse of the chapter brings us to the point where Absalom comes back into his father's presence. The king summons him. Absalom bows before him, and the king kisses him. That the king kissed Absalom indicates David's restoration of Absalom back into the family. But Absalom did not come to be reconciled. Absalom came with other motives. He tried to regain his father's affection by pretending to love and respect him. And although David was willing to overlook the past and to move ahead, those seeds of bitterness had already been planted and would soon bear fruit of conspiracy and rebellion. David's delay in coming to terms with his son ultimately led to disaster. But for the moment, there was peace. And that's where we're going to stop today.